Chapter 3, An Embarrassment. Mount Vernon, New York, September 23, 1933. The dressing room was a mess. The floor was dirty. And the doors were broken. The air smelled of old sweat. "He's a slow guy," said Joe Gould. "My grandmother could beat him. It'll be an easy fight." Joe was wearing one of his usual fine brown suits. Jim knew nobody else who hadn't been ruined by the crash. The manager was taping up Jim's hands before the fight. He squeezed Jim's right hand. Then saw the look of pain on the fighter's face. He played with the hand, examining it carefully. "This break needs a couple of weeks to get better," he said. "Why didn't you tell me, Jim?" Jim didn't look up. He had fought in March. Although his right hand was still hurt from a fight in January. His opponent was good. And Jim, fighting with a bad hand, had lost in 4 rounds. But he couldn't stop fighting because he needed the prize money for his family. He fought several more times, hurting his right hand again and again. By now he had to use drugs to control the pain. There was never enough time for it to get better before the next fight. Joe Gould knew that it wasn't legal to let a boxer fight in this condition. If something went wrong in the ring, it could mean the end for both Joe and Jim. "I can't get any work," said Jim quietly. "We need the money." The little manager thought of May and the children. "Okay," he said. "I'll tape your hand double." Gould knew that double taping was against the rules, too. Keep your left hand in his face and, when you can, hit him with a big right. If you finish early, I'll buy you an ice cream. He led the boxer past the crowd toward the ring. This crowd was very different from the one at Madison Square Garden years earlier. These people looked poorer and hungrier. As Jim climbed into the ring, a radio reporter spoke into a microphone. Just 5 years ago, Jim Braddock was thought to be ready to fight for the world heavyweight title. But he has lost 10 fights in the last year. The crowd started to shout louder when Abe Feldman walked toward the ring, punching the air. "Now Braddock fights Feldman," continued the radio man. "A young fighter who has won 17 times and lost just once." Jim froze. This was the boxer Joe's grandmother could beat? Feldman was the crowd's favorite. He was young and handsome, like Braddock had been years earlier, when he had an unbroken nose and 2 pretty ears. Braddock's gloves fell to his sides. Joe pulled Jim's gloves back up. "Jimmy, what are you going to do?" Jim closed his eyes. And everything went away: the crowd's shouts, May's worried looks, Ben's gun, Jay's silent tears, all the mistakes of the last 4 years. He opened his eyes. "I'm going to get an ice cream." Feldman's glove hit Braddock in the face. A hard punch. Jim tried to hit back. But Feldman blocked his punches. "Come on, Jimmy," cried Gould from the corner. The manager was sweating almost as much as Braddock, as he jabbed the air and shouted advice. But Braddock could only think about the pain of Feldman's punches. The younger man hit him again and again. But none of Braddock's punches seemed to hit Feldman, who danced around his opponent easily. Suddenly, Feldman threw a combination of punches that threw Braddock back onto the ropes. The crowd began to boo. "Don't just stand there," shouted Gould. Braddock saw an opening in Feldman's defenses and threw a right cross. It hit the fighter's chin and knocked him back. Jim stepped in to finish his opponent. But Feldman put his head down as Braddock threw his big punch. The leather glove hit the top of Feldman's head. There was a sound of bone on bone. The pain in Braddock's right hand was terrible. He held on to Feldman as the bell announced the end of the round. The referee had to send both fighters back to their corners. Gould quickly took Braddock's right glove off. Even under all the tape, he could see that the hand was really broken. "I can't let you continue," he said. Jim thought of the prize money. "I can use my left," he said. "Don't let Feldman get too close," said Gould, quickly tying the glove back up. "Do what you can with your left." But Braddock had never had a left hand punch. Now he couldn't even block with his right, and his feet felt heavy and slow. Punch after punch fell on him. Time usually slowed down for Jim in the ring. But now it was flying past. He began to throw out his left hand in wild jabs. These missed, but then one punch hit Feldman on the chin and hurt him. Again. The two boxers held on to each other. The crowd began to boo again and shout insults. Go home. Braddock decided that maybe he had one more good right punch in him. He pulled his arm back and threw the punch. It hurt Feldman. But the pain was much worse for Braddock. Under the double tape, his right hand was completely broken. Feldman hit him back, and again Braddock held on to his opponent. He almost fainted from the pain. The angry boos from the crowd were so loud that he almost didn't hear the bell. An embarrassment. That's what it was. An embarrassment. Jimmy Johnston, the big fight organizer, was shouting angrily at Joe Gould, who was unusually quiet. 30 minutes earlier, the referee had ended the fight, announcing that nobody was the winner, because Braddock wasn't fit to continue. Okay. So he's fighting while he's hurt, said Joe. Maybe your fighters can afford to have a month's rest between fights. He almost never hits his opponents anymore, answered Johnston. And now the referee has to stop the fight. A fighter like that keeps the public away. Ticket money will fall. The big man paused. We're taking away his boxing license. Whatever Braddock was going to do in boxing, he's done it. When Jim heard the bad news from his manager, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dressing room was small and dirty. So Joe led his boxer back into the hall. The lights threw long shadows on the empty ring. Joe began taping a piece of wood to Jim's broken hand. Until you get to the hospital. As he taped the hand, Joe couldn't hold back the memories. All the fights. And all the dreams. All the hopes that Jim Braddock would be champion one day. Now those hopes lay as broken as the fighter's hand. Joe cleared his throat. Jimmy. Sometimes you just can't change things. I'm telling you. It's finished. The boxer didn't jump up, shout, or scream. He was quiet for a long time. His face was wet with tears. Get me one more fight, Joe, said the fighter. We're down to our last dollar. I'm sorry, Jimmy. After all they had been through together, Joe really was sorry. They had stayed the best of friends through good times and bad. Now it really was the end. Tonight. This was goodbye. Jim didn't even look up as his manager walked away, leaving him on the seats beside the dark ring. Alone. Chapter 4. A New Life. Oh, dear God. Jim knew that. This was the last time he would see this look on May's face after a fight. I don't have the money, he said, too tired to find the words to make it easier. They refused to pay me, took away my license. They said that I'm finished as a boxer. The fear in May's eyes turned to anger. She didn't care about boxing licenses or fight rules. She only cared about her husband. Jimmy. What happened to your hand? It's broken in 3 places. May wasn't thinking about boxing now. If you can't work, we won't be able to pay the bills, buy food. We'll have to send the children to stay with my sister. May, I can still work. Jim said. Get the black shoe polish from the cupboard. Nobody will give me a job if they see this cast on my hand. So we'll cover it up. May saw it in her husband's eyes, then Jim Braddock wasn't going to be beaten. I'll cut your coat. So you can put it on over the cast. She said, opening the shoe polish and spreading it on the white cast. Now we just need a piece of steak for your face. Jim Braddock. She laughed. 6-year-old. Rosie's face appeared around the blanket. Jim smiled at her. Deciding, not for the first time, that he was a lucky man to have May as his wife. It was early morning. And Jim was standing outside the familiar locked gate at Newark Docks. As the sun appeared in the east, the foreman, Jake, walked up. Jim put his broken hand behind him. The doctor had said it would be useless for months. 1, 2, 3. As usual. Jake walked along the group, pointing to the workers he wanted. 5, 6, 7. Jim stood tall. 8. Jake's eyes fell on Jim. Then the foreman pointed at him. 9. A win. Jim stepped forward, knowing that he was one of the lucky few who had worked that day. Minutes later, Jim was meeting his new partner. The young, handsome man introduced himself as Mike Wilson. What happened to you? he asked Jim, staring at the black and blue marks on his face. I got into a fight, Jim told the man. Together, the two men had to move a mountain of sacks from one area to another. It took two strong men to lift each sack, using big hooks to pick the sacks up. Jim found the work very difficult. He had never really used his left hand for anything. It was really hard using the hook with it, while trying to hide the cast on his right hand. There was a fighter called Jim Braddock, said Mike. I listened to his fights on the radio. There's another fighter using the name now. But this guy's no good. Jim saw the smile on Mike's face. He almost laughed himself. But then the sack fell from the hook in his hand. Mike saw Jim's cast. This isn't going to work, he said. You can't do this job with a bad hand. And you can't slow me down. I need this job. Jim gave his partner a quick look. Listen, I can do this. Suddenly, a new voice shouted. What's happening here? It was the foreman. And he was staring at Jim's bad hand. Instead of trying to explain, Jim sank the hook back into the sack with his left hand. Then he waited, unable to do anything until his partner moved. After a few terrible seconds, Mike sunk the hook into his end of the sack. The two men lifted the heavy sack together and carried it across the dock. Then they moved for another sack. Then another, and another. Jake, the foreman, stood there with arms crossed, watching every move. Finally, he walked away. Jim lifted his face to Mike. Thanks, he said. It was raining hard. But May didn't move. Her place in this soup line was too valuable. Hundreds of people were ahead of her. But a lot were behind her, too. They were all waiting for free soup and bread from the truck at the head of the line. May held Rosie in her arms. The two boys ran around playing. You need to stand for a few minutes, Rosie, said May. I don't want to, cried Rosie. The sidewalk's wet. Who's making all this noise? Immediately, Rosie's crying stopped. Her father appeared beside her, big and strong and with a smile on his face for her. As he lifted Rosie, Jim told May, I got a job at the docks. May noticed something inside Jim's coat. His boxing shoes. She wasn't surprised to see them. A few boxing organizers in expensive suits couldn't stop her husband from fighting, even if they had taken away his license. Are you training today? She asked him. I was thinking of selling them, said Jim. Then we can pay the grocer by the end of the week. May didn't know what to say. At last she said, don't take less than $1, Jim. He saw the tears in her eyes. Go home. I'll stand in line. She handed him the empty pot and took the children home. Jim's eyes followed them. And then he looked forward again, turning his collar up against the wind. The soup truck seemed far, far away. But Jim had become good at waiting. Hours later, familiar sounds greeted Jim's ears, hitting punching bags. This was the gym that Jim had trained in for years. It was the place where he had first met Joe Gould. Even now, part of him wanted to get into the ring and fight. As he entered the gym, the usual smell of leather and sweat hit him. He looked at all the boxers training hard. Jimmy, said a friendly voice. Have you come to train? It was Joe Jeanette, the owner of the gym. The old fighter had never been a champion. But he had always been a hero too. A great boxer with quick hands and a knockout punch, Jeanette had been one of the best heavyweights in the country. But he was a black, and few white boxers agreed to fight him. Jeanette never had the chance to fight for the title. But Jeanette couldn't stay away from the fight game. He had become a referee. And he had opened this gym. He was never too busy to give advice to a young boxer. Jim tried to return Jeanette's smile. But he couldn't. He put the soup pot down and pulled his boxing shoes out of his coat. A few minutes later, Joe Gould stepped onto the gym floor. He was here to see a new boxer. Not Jim Braddock. Joe watched as Jim handed his boxing shoes to a young, black boxer, who paid Jim 10 cents. Then Jim picked up his soup and bread and turned toward the front entrance. Joe Jeanette looked up and saw the manager standing at the back of the gym. His eyes held a question for Joe, but Joe just shook his head and stepped behind the door. It's better for both of us if Jim doesn't see me, Joe thought.